Welcome back, Rothlats listeners, to another episode with me, Mackenzie Tiggs. Today I have Cameron on with Cold Plunge Cam, and I'm so excited to really deep dive into how this is actually benefiting our health, what this process is, and his own mental health journey as well. So if you don't know who Cold Cam is, then please go on to social media, check him out, but more importantly, listen to the podcast and you'll hear about him today. So Cam, thank you so much for coming on. I'm excited to just kind of dive into this conversation.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes. Okay. So I want to know a little bit of what your background has been through this journey, because it sounds like, or from what I've gathered, it's kind of a mental health that started this and then kind of has brought you through this journey.
Yeah, it depends how far back you want to go. I've always had kind of a struggle with mental health starting as a kid. I was diagnosed when I was 9 with anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, OCD, and Tourette syndrome. And so starting from a very young age, I needed to find ways to learn to cope outside of, just kind of the typical. And so I felt like it put me in a position where I was always trying to be more self-aware and always trying to learn more about what I can and cannot tolerate. And so that was something that I dealt with ever since I was 9. I moved to Boise in 2020 for a job opportunity in finance, and I just finished grad school. And when I moved up here, I got hit with a wave of depression that I had never experienced before. It wasn't one of the things that was in my wheelhouse, something that I had experienced on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. And it was new to me, caught me completely off guard. And so I almost felt like I dove back into this diagnosis type of state, or this idea of just trying to figure out, find things to work, find things to help with the way I was feeling, understand what was the underlying cause or what could be the root cause of it. And ultimately came to discover cold plunging. I had a friend come to visit one time, and he saw how close I lived to the Boise River and was like, "You ever go in there at all?" And I thought, no, not really. I mean, I lived there for over a year already. And he was like, "Dude, I would be in here every morning, like just feeling the water, enjoying it." And then the conversation kind of evolved into ice baths, and then it just kind of took off from there. But yeah, I've more recently, I think I've dealt with depression and with kind of some mood swings, and there's been some of that I've shared with followers, and what I think may or may not be contributing to that. All around mental health, and just kind of sharing my journey.
Yeah. I'm super interested, especially because being here in Idaho, if the depression started during a certain season, or like when did you, or kind of what's your theory on where this has started?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I think I can't narrow it down to a season, because I think it kind of came in waves at first, and so it wasn't really, I mean, the winter doesn't help, obviously, but I think it was a bunch of different things. I think it was me making comparisons with others that I was close to, and where I thought I was in life and my place in life versus them. And so there was a therapy aspect to it that I needed to work out and come to understand. There was a physical aspect as well. I wasn't outside getting as much sunlight. I wasn't exercising as much. My nutrition wasn't very good. My hormone levels were off. And then there was a, kind of a mental side, internal side of it as well. So it's hard to say what really caused it, but there were a lot of things I started addressing early on to try and figure out how to help and to fix it.
And I think you nailed it too, where the winters in Idaho don't help it. And what I've noticed, especially being in real estate, is that there are people that cannot endure our winters. They're not the craziest winters, but when somebody comes from out of state that is used to so much sun, and then they come to our state where winters, we can have these, overcast days, and in this, I want to say brain fog, but I literally have brain fog. like inversion. There we go. There's the word. When we have these inversions, especially in the wintertime, when we literally don't see the sun. And in what I've noticed is there's a lot of people that it starts in the wintertime, though maybe things have like accumulated before that, but that's really kind of where their first experience is with depression. Where were you seeing, or kind of what symptoms were you seeing where you're like, hey, like I got to do something about this? Mindbase is the official sponsor of Raw Thoughts podcast. Mindbase is the only mental health and wellness technology platform that goes far beyond their traditional wellness app for first responders specifically. It uses data to optimize a proactive and people-driven approach to first responders' wellness. Please reach out today to see about getting Mindbase into your agency to help our first responders.
Yeah, probably what I noticed first were the thoughts, and what I mean by the thoughts was just the negativity, the lack of drive, the lack of motivation, the comparisons I felt like I was making all the time, and the like retrospective thinking of looking to my past and looking at the decisions I've made and how that has lined up or stacked up against others, family or friends. That was probably the first piece I noticed. But there was a physical aspect that came and that I noticed later too, of just not having much energy at all, not wanting to move, not wanting to get out, and probably most of all, not wanting to change this boring routine that I was in, not wanting to change it at all because it turned into a scary thing where it was so outside of my unknown, or like my wheelhouse. It was so unknown, and it felt debilitating. It felt paralyzing almost. Those were the things I noticed at first.
Yeah. Where did you, when you noticed that, and I know you have been trying to get off of antidepressants. So when was the point, like, where did you know where you're like, this isn't my wheelhouse. I need to go take another step and go see a doctor, or, and I want to explain this a little bit to the listeners because a lot of them don't know how to do this, and you've already done it. And so being, this example of like, hey, this is what my experience has been. And how did you get yourself to knowing like, hey, I need something more?
Yeah, it probably became the final thing. It was the final lever for me to pull. I was running out of things. I felt like I was doing everything. And I get emotional thinking about it because I was doing so much work. The cold plunging was so much. I was committing to that 3 to 4 days a week, all winter long. I noticed it was helping, and we can, dive into that later too. But I was changing my nutrition. I was supplementing. I was working out more. I was developing a really strict sleep protocol. I was doing all sorts of things to just be like, I just want to feel better. I just want my mood better. And the final thing, I was going to therapy too, right? I was going to therapy once a week, trying all sorts of different types of therapy, traditional talk therapy, EMDR therapy. I was doing neurofeedback. I was doing all sorts of stuff. And the final thing was the medication. And when I was 9 and I was diagnosed, I was put on Paxil, which is an SSRI for anxiety, because I became so, the way my mom described it was, I became paralyzed with fear, where I would be given an assignment in school. I wouldn't know where to start, and I would just become so overwhelmed that it was like I would just implode, and I couldn't do anything. I just was stuck. And it seemed like that was the only thing at the time, what is it, 1999 probably. It was just one of the only options. And I stayed on SSRIs. I'm still on SSRIs, but I've been on SSRIs for 23 years now.
Wow.
And Paxil was 20 years of that. And then over the last few years, I'd kind of moved around a little bit. And then in 2018, I was put on Klonopin as well, which is a benzodiazepine. And that was for one panic attack I had one summer. Something that was just kind of I don't know if you want to call it like an extraneous event, just something that was not common. And I ended up relying on that more and more. And so anyways, I got to this point where I was like, maybe it's the meds. And I can't say that is the answer for everybody, or even for me, because I'm not at the end of that tunnel yet. But it was a final thing where I was like, I want to know what it's like now to get to the end of that tunnel off of the medication, because the last time I knew what that felt like was when I was 9.
Mm.
And I would like to think I've developed a lot more skills, a lot more coping mechanisms, a lot more things for me to be able to handle it on my own. And so May of 2023 was when I started that tapering process off of the SSRI, which is Lexapro currently. And I've worked that down from, 20 milligrams was the starting dose, down to I'm at 9 milligrams now. And we can kind of go into how I did that too, and reduce dosages and stuff if you want. But and in November, I paused at 9 because I then turned my attention towards the Klonopin, the benzodiazepine, which, from what I've been told and meeting with psychiatrists and therapists and all sorts of folks, is the benzos are like one of the hardest things to get off, and could be a major contributor to my mood swings and my mood in general and the way I'm feeling. And I started to notice that too, that perhaps the Klonopin and the inconsistent nature and as needed prescription, the way I was taking it, was contributing to these mood swings, is a hypothesis I have.
Yeah.
And so that's my current goal right now. And I've worked my way down on dose, and I'm getting close to 0, but it's been a ride. Yeah. It's been a roller coaster. You know?
I love that you said that was your hypothesis, because life is truly just this experiment. And when we look at the scientific, questioning, it's like we have to start with these questions. We have to come up with a hypothesis, and then we have to test that hypothesis. Is this going in a way of saying yes, or is this going in a direction of the data saying no, and supporting that question that we've asked? And I just love you being able to even say that, because I think so many individuals, especially with mental health, they want it to be this very direct and specific route, and it just isn't, because we're complex humans. And so therefore, we're going to have complex solutions for us. And that takes a lot of testing. That takes a lot of, understanding. And I do want to kind of go through the process of you, changing those dosages, because especially being a paramedic, and what I have seen in the field is that people they make that decision where they're like, well, I'm feeling better, I want to be off my medications. And they cold turkey quit, and they revert back to why they're on the medications. And they haven't done that in a safe way to be able to taper and to be able to have kind of those interim, coping skills and strategies that they have. So what was that process, in going through and deciding to lower your dosages?
Yeah. I have to preface all of it by saying I'm not a doctor, not a psychiatrist, right? Not a trained professional. But I can explain the process and the things that I've been learning and researching and studying about in terms of how to taper effectively and safely. I started by meeting with my psychiatrist, right? And talking about it, and even sharing it on social media too, of like, hey, I'm thinking of starting to reduce my dose. And it was a few followers I had who introduced me to the idea of a hyperbolic taper, not my psychiatrist, which I still think is, to this day, is just hilarious. But these followers had said, hey, look into, this video, this information source, this manual on what a hyperbolic taper is, to help you understand a little bit of like the pharmacology behind what happens as you reduce doses. And a lot of what you'll see, and a lot of the advice that people will give, or that doctors may give, is that you can just kind of reduce. Let's say you start at 20 milligrams like I did. You can just reduce in a linear fashion that just goes straight down, or diagonal down like that, from 20 to 15 to 10 to 5 to 0. And that each one of those steps should affect you in about the same way, is what they would say. But what's not shared is that the closer you get to 0, the more it's needed to go slow, because every incremental milligram as you drop starts to mean more and more to your body and to your brain. And so for these folks who would go 20 to 15, wouldn't wouldn't really notice much of
Right.
difficulty, right? And much of the withdrawal symptoms. But when you go 15 to 10, it's going to start to feel more intense. From like a mathematics standpoint, we go, well, I mean, like it's the same amount, but if you look at it in percentage terms, it's a much higher percentage reduction going from 20 to 15. That's 70 or a 25% reduction. 15 to 10, you're now looking at a 33% reduction. And then you start trying to do the same thing, that percentage reduction is going to go up. So it's kind of a math, thing you have to look at too. But I started 20 to 15, felt great. I moved, and I didn't do it as like a by the book hyperbolic taper. I kind of just did it to how I was feeling.
Yeah.
So I moved from 15 to 13, and then 13 to 12, and 12 to 11. And I started kind of going down by 1 milligram increments. And every single one of those drops, I was starting to feel after about 2 to 3 weeks. And so that's the other component to it that is important for people to recognize is the amount of time you give your body to reduce dose, right? And going 2 weeks and then moving on isn't enough time. And if you look at what they say when they first put you on the medication, they say allow 4 to 6 weeks for your body to start feeling the effects. So going off, it's like you should at least imagine the same thing, right? And so, for anyone wondering like, okay, well, how did I reduce dose that precisely? There are places called compounding pharmacies that give you the ability to do that. You have to work with your psychiatrist to write you a prescription for a compounding pharmacy. And then what they do is they go in and they make those very precise dosages depending on what your goals are and you're trying to hit. And so that is, the safest, and this is the furthest I've ever gotten in trying to taper, by using those pharmacies.
Wow.
Yeah. Trying to think. Yeah. And the other interesting part about it too is it's not the compounding pharmacies. It's not covered by insurance, which I always thought was pretty interesting too, right? Is it can take you one doctor's visit that averages less than 15 minutes in the US to be written a prescription for an SSRI or for an antidepressant and to get started like that. But the process of getting off the medication safely can take months or years.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, the insurance for getting the medication pays for almost everything. For trying to taper off and use a compounding pharmacy to do it safely and effectively, you're paying out of pocket.
Yeah.
And that's one area I've noticed, at least recently, where our system might be a little broken.
It's
right.
It's very broken.
Just from experience, right, so far. But it's been quite the journey, we're now almost a year in on just this process of me tapering off the 2 medications, and I anticipate it being another year at least. And this could also be because I've been on them for so long, and I want to go as slow as I can and be as careful as I can, because I feel like I have a pretty high stress life and all the things that are going on and stuff. And so I want to just be as careful as I can. But what I would say to folks who, let's say they want to do the same thing and they feel like with where they're at in life, that's the path they want to take is tapering off a medication. The tricky part a lot of times is the things that you feel as you're tapering off a medication seem to be exactly the reason why you went on it in the first place.
Yep.
And so it becomes this mind game of where you start to feel it as you're tapering off. You go, man, I haven't been this anxious in forever. I haven't felt this way in forever. And all those symptoms are starting to come back up. And something inside of you starts to tell you, well, this is the reason why you started it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so fighting that belief, that cognition, whatever it is in your head, because the withdrawal symptoms are many times identical to like relapse
Right.
symptoms, you know?
Right.
And so being patient with your body and learning that this is going to take time, give myself 4 to 6 weeks in between every single dose reduction and just be as patient as can be. And just don't forget why you started. And that's just the advice I would give folks too.
Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, our system is so broken. It's not even funny. And it's like, you don't even know where to start. And I have been, I would say, exposed to some things that that our hospitals and our surgeons and our doctors are doing that it's like, holy shit. Like, it actually really disturbs me. And it'll be in a different podcast, but you know, with people that have a do not resuscitate, and our surgeons, they're taking them off of that while they go into surgery. And it's like, but that's why they have it. Like, you're literally going against their will. So I have my own, I'm going to say, issues with the hospital, the medical. You know, I got a text message from a dear friend that literally told their psychiatrist, they're like, how about you go listen to the Raw Thoughts podcast, because you would learn more from them than you're teaching me. And to even just vocalize that and say how broken the system is, and we're really battling, you know, the pharmaceuticals, and it shows you that they don't want to get you off of these medications. It's revenue. It is getting people sick so that they go to the hospital. It's getting people stuck on these medications so that they have to be dependent on it and pay for these, and how societally we are going in a downward spiral so fast. My question to you is, how has cold plunging been in combination with this, and where are you seeing that relief?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from a high level, it's about getting back to basics and getting back to the protocols and the therapies and just the natural options that there are for us to learn how to cope and learn how to deal with things and overcome them. Cold plunging was one of the tools for me to start learning how to do that to work without medication. What I've noticed when I started especially was it's very intense when you first get in, especially if you haven't done it before. Your adrenaline spikes. There's a little bit of discomfort. Your breathing rate spikes. Your heart rate spikes.
You go
And
into a sympathetic nervous system response.
yeah, you go into cold shock. But the things that happen inside your body when that happens is fascinating. All of the different things, so much so that I don't think we don't know everything that happens. There's so many different, compounds and different, I don't even know, like transfers and things inside that is just fascinating. And cold shock proteins, I mean, there's a bunch of those that we don't even know the full extent of what they do. But what I do know is how I felt afterwards was just this complete central nervous system reset, where it almost felt like I would wake up from a really good nap, where I was just calm, composed, relaxed, still energetic, and still like I had focus. But I just felt good. Like I just felt like I wanted to be nice to people and just continue with my day, and everything kind of aligned, all of the to-dos and tasks and events. And it didn't feel so overwhelming and scattered in my head. And the interesting part about that is that it would last for 2, 3, 4 hours. It was like an extended release. And it just felt so good. And so something that lasts for that long, there's gotta be a therapeutic benefit in my opinion, right?
For sure.
And so I started trying to figure out ways to incorporate that on a weekly basis that would help me with combating stress and with anxiety and with improving my mood and dealing with the depression. And from a depression standpoint, what I noticed, because I would feel it, to your point, I'd feel it a lot in the winter. And that's when the river's the coldest too. And so it's like I got the tool I need for the times that are the hardest. And all the different thoughts that would go through my head, right? That I just hated. I didn't want to deal with. And it was too much. It's too overwhelming. It was like I knew I could get in the river and all of that would just disappear, because now I'm in a river in February, in January, that's 38 degrees. I'm just trying to breathe. I'm just trying to survive. My thoughts are non-existent. And that became a relief for me, just that aspect alone. And this was before I even started posting anything on social media. I went a full year doing that, the cold plunges and everything, before I even posted about it. It was just a full year of me reflecting internally and experimenting too with the whole thing of, man, how long could I stay in here? And what do I notice after, depending on the time of day, depending on what I've eaten, and just playing around with it. And I mean, I would get to a point where it was middle of winter and I'd sit in there 14, 15, 16 minutes and just wait for something to happen. Because at that point, I didn't care as much about safety. Just the mindset I was in, I didn't care. I just want to feel something. And so I would experiment, and it was like I would just get done and I would just feel so good. So good. And it was like all those worries, all those hypotheticals in my head, all of those made up things, and those negative cognitions and core beliefs, and it just would go away. And so it was like rinse and repeat. Let's do it again, and so that's just kind of how it all evolved over time.
It's so interesting, hearing you talk about this on like a playful aspect, because I think so many people think of it as like, oh, I have to do it, or I have to get better by doing this. And they put a lot of pressure on the outcomes, and you're really taking the steps and enjoying the process of it. And that's really cool to see. From my medical experience, I want to deep dive a little bit more for our listeners of like what is going on, because I think, I see there's so much, especially right now, and, around the new year when it happens, where people are like, oh, cold plunge, cold plunge, cold plunge, and they don't quite understand the mental side of it. And yes, it is really incredible for our whole bodies to be immersed in that, and what that does on a cellular level. But more importantly, you described that when you got into the water, you had your, heart rate increase. You had a sympathetic reaction to that. When people have a lot of trauma and a lot of, they've been in that fight or flight, you can feel like you're going back to that experience, because you're like, holy shit, what's going on? And most of the times when people get in, especially if they haven't experienced it, they'll become really tight. They'll become like they can't move in it. And what they'll actually do is hold their breath. And they want to make these like, and at that point is where the mental game comes in. And you literally have to take over. You have to consciously take over, because your subconscious is saying, you're unsafe. This is dangerous. Get out. Like, this isn't going to keep you thriving. And your consciousness has to come in and say, you're okay. You're safe. And by doing that, you can do that by tapping into your breath. In through your nose, hold, out through your nose. And just being able to do that, that's where that self-control comes from. That's really where these, the mental aspect comes from, of not thinking about those really dangerous points. And before we started talking, like recording on this podcast, I kind of brought up the aspect, if you knew anything about when you're already kind of in that high response. And for listeners right now, just the way that my life is going, I do have complex PTSD. I do have these times where I can get stuck in the fight or flight, and not even getting stuck, but I'm going to say I'm more reactive. And so something like a spatula that hits the ground in the kitchen, gets knocked off, I literally freak, because my body doesn't understand that the threat is actually really low. It believes that the threat is really high because of these experiences that I've been in. And so the question to you was, when you're in those high responses, and this is more of a discussion, and for our listeners, if you know the answer to this, I would be curious for you to write in, because I don't know what it is. I just know my body. And maybe it's just my own thinking that I'm already getting triggered by all of these other incidences. Me putting myself into the cold plunge, though I know that it's me talking myself down from it, is that now I'm adding another trigger to my body and to the experiences that I'm already having. I kind of have to have these like softer modalities right now because I'm in such a hypervigilant state. Have you noticed through your experience and me kind of describing this as well, of when you are more reactive to things, how that is kind of associated with cold plunge?
It's a really good question, and again, I have to preface with like I don't know the exact science and everything behind it, but from my experience, I mean, first of all, it's never an easy thing. It's always difficult, and you always fight yourself internally on doing it, especially when you are stressed, in fight or flight. It's the last thing you want to do. I have noticed, and like I was saying before, when I'm in that type of a state or in a panic state, because for me, how it manifests is like a tightness in my chest, and when I get really anxious, I'll even get kind of a burning, tingling sensation that goes from my chest up to my neck, and I can't control the thoughts. They're all over the place. It was in those moments where I would just put myself in the river. It was like no more thinking. Physically, I'm just gonna do it. And I can't think of a single time that hasn't worked, and that it has exacerbated the feeling. I can't think of a single time. There is an important part of that where rest is important. So, I mean, doing this every single day, I don't think is good for you. I think it's important for us to also acknowledge that rest is important, rest is productive, and we need to give our bodies time to adjust and reset, and et cetera. I think the same way you were saying that the mental game comes into it again is the same way that when you put yourself in there, the physical is going to take over and can possibly reward you with those feel-good endorphins that are going to come. You know, you sitting in a room and being in fight or flight, just like that, nothing's going to change. There's no physical activity, no physical action that's being taken that's going to reward you internally, mentally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's like putting yourself in the cold is just the most extreme form of physical action. I mean, it's gonna happen.
Yeah.
And it's all gonna be involuntary, which is the scary part about it, because that's kind of how your trauma and your PTSD happens anyways, is it's very involuntary, and you're trying to learn how to deal with it. So I really can see both sides, but I would just try and admonish people to take a step out of the comfort zone,
Yeah. And it's so interesting you just talking about it too, because, there's almost two sides that I can hear from you as well, where it's like, no, push yourself. Like maybe that's what you need right now. Right. Like, and maybe that's what I needed to hear today, where it's like, just go fucking do it. Like you're obviously in this response from, everything that's happening in life, that it helps you do what helps you. And then there's this completely other side where it's like, yeah, but if you're innately telling yourself that you need safety so much right now, and don't continue to put yourself in those unsafe, and though it's not unsafe, my nervous system feels like it's unsafe. And that's where, these cold plunges, the mental state of it, your body does not understand that you are okay. Your response is that you're going to die. You need to get out. And it's your consciousness, like I said, that you have to retell yourself, like, I am safe, I am okay. And having to just say those words is an understanding of like how unsafe we can feel.
Yeah.
And whether that be our past, whether that be currently, but like we talk about fight or flight, but we don't necessarily talk about safety and sound. And that's the complete opposite. That's the part that we want to thrive in, the connector part, versus these, eruptor and these different moods that we can get into, and different modes that we can get into of reacting. And, it'll be interesting to see, like, at what point am I like, all right, today's the day, like, we're doing it again, and like see how I feel. And I'm like, fuck, Mackenzie, like, you should have gotten in this like a week ago.
At what point does it push you over the edge and you're finally just like, you know what, I'm doing it.
Yeah.
This is it. And
yeah.
I couldn't agree more, because I see it as like the best controlled stress environment for you to practice in, and to start developing those, reframing the way you see any type of stress at all.
Yeah.
I mean, the cold is like the perfect example. Anybody walking outside, I mean, you said it yourself. It's like you tense up, the muscles get tense, you clench your jaw, you stop breathing. But that's not just the cold. You do that in all sorts of places.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And we don't even realize it.
Yeah.
Like, people listening to this, I'm curious to know, like, just loosen up your jaw. If your tongue, we don't realize it, how much our tongue gets pressed to the top of our roof of our mouth, and like how tight we are. And like, just let your jaw loose, let your tongue relax. Like, and it sounds so silly and so like, I'm going to say woo woo, because you're like, what? But like, this comes back to our central nervous system. And there's so much control over that, and that we have to control when that gets haywire. Yeah. And say, there's a lot of times where it's like, I am safe, I am okay, this is a good place for you. And with that, I'm curious to know, like, with your social media, this is like kind of pivoting, but you did this for a full year without really telling, I'm going to say, a lot of people, and then you expose it to people. How has that experience been? Because your social media is, it's out there. Like, a lot of people follow it. Like, when I told one of my best friends from grade school that you were going to be on the podcast, she was like, what? I've been watching him on TikTok for years. Like, how'd you make that connection?
That's
funny. And I'm like, oh shit. Like, yeah, I look at people's followers, but like, those are true followers. Like, they're actually out there, So what has that experience been with all of this?
Yeah. So like you said, I mean, the first year was just me doing it, the ice baths, the cold plunges myself. And it was just like a purely personal activity, reflection. I tried to get some family to join me, and they did. Right. And so I would share it with friends and family, etc. But that following summer, the same month, right? So it was July 21 I started. In July 22, I posted the first video, because everything I was seeing online on Instagram was, I mean, it was as intimidating as it could possibly look. It was your athletes and your bodybuilders and your weightlifters and your Olympians and all these people. And it was just, and it was always an intense experience. And I just felt like, looking at that, I was like, there's not going to be many people who are going to go, yeah, I want to do that, And so some of my first videos, I was just getting into an ice bath, and I would have like a Chick-fil-A sandwich and just pretend like nothing was wrong. Like I was just some normal kid who was just like sitting down in an ice bath, or like a Domino's pizza. And because I was just trying to almost break that idea of you needed to be one of these high performance people to potentially see any sort of benefits. But at the same time, it was kind of ironic that I was doing that. But like, so I wanted to approach it all from a mental health perspective. And I saw that as my niche, and I was like, I think there's something here. I really do. And within the first month and a half, I hit 10,000 followers, and it happened so fast.
Wow.
And a little bit about my background too is I've always been very inside my head, but like very analytical, and went back to school, grad school for business and finance, and just was very math oriented person, and I love numbers and patterns and all sorts of stuff. And so I almost saw it as a game with myself of like, I'm gonna figure out how this thing works, like this
Yeah.
social media thing. Like I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna tweak all the little things and levers and see what works and what doesn't, and re-replicate that and do an A/B test, and like I was having so much fun with it, and trying all these different things. And within a month and a half, it hit 10,000 followers. I had about 4 different videos going viral at the same time, just taking off. And within 4 days, I went from 10 to 100,000 followers. And
Wow.
it catapulted. And it was like they all snowballed at the same time, and just kind of took off. And it was at that point, we're not talking like September. I was like, man, I need to figure out what like the game plan is here. And some of the best advice I got towards the end of the year was, just go on the river and start telling your story.
Mm.
Just start sharing your story and talking about you and talking about what you're going through and what your difficulties are and your experience and all of that. And so that just became the pursuit of just relentless vulnerability, sharing everything I'm going through on a daily basis. And it was everything. It truly was everything. I couldn't it was almost like I couldn't not tell the truth. Like, it was the anxiety, it was the Tourette's, the depression, the comparisons, going to therapy, taking medication, all of it. And because I just gotten to a point where I know how much I didn't care about myself. I didn't care any longer. It was like I knew I didn't. So why in the world would I care what anybody else thought?
Mm.
Because it just didn't matter anymore. And if I could potentially put something out there that would help others, and it's like there would be no such thing as embarrassment. I didn't care what I thought about myself. I didn't care what happened to me, and so I just developed this I don't know, kind of this tough shell of just, I'm just gonna share it all,
Yeah.
and it doesn't matter. So
Yeah. I think it's, very courageous of you to being able to share those because you are very vulnerable. You are very raw, even, on your social media. And that's, something that I was like, oh, wow, like that's amazing. I want to hear more of his story. Obviously, bringing you onto the podcast and been able to, be at some events and get to know you more on a personal basis, which is amazing. And, one of the other questions that I have for you, because you're a young male, like you're going through the shit, and I see so many young males that are not even willing to try, not even aware of what's going on, not even aware of like where they are internally. And, to one, give you kudos for like actually understanding and having a curiosity of yourself. Even if you didn't feel like it in that moment, your longevity has shown that, where it's like, I want to try to figure this out. I want to try to figure myself out. What advice would you give to those younger males like you that are just going through the shit, don't know where to turn to, don't care about themselves like you did? They're just like hands up, like, I don't give a fuck what happens.
yeah, yeah. I mean, first, thank you for what you said. A couple things I would think. One is I have this idea that all of us think we're the only ones dealing with something. And that's something I struggled my entire life with. And I think is why this has become such a passion for me, is because, I was diagnosed with Tourette's as a kid. I thought I was broken my whole life. I didn't meet someone else with Tourette's until I was 18.
Wow.
And so I spent my entire childhood and adolescence thinking I was alone. I was the only one that had that,
You were
and
different.
I was different, and I was broken, and all of these things that to this day I'm still trying to work through in therapy.
Mhm.
And so number one is like, just go talk to people, anybody, right? And you will start to learn that you are not you are not alone, and that there's so many of us out there that feel a certain way, that have a certain condition, that struggle with a certain thing, that have been affected by a certain event. Like, there's so many things, and there's so many people. So I think that self-isolation is a huge reason, and I think is a huge contributor to some of the mental health issues, and is why I've personally been making a point to try and socialize more, and to go to those events that I met you at, and to try and branch out a little bit more, because that is a huge component of mental health, is branching out and socializing. Two, I would say, for those people, I mean, every day is a bonus, right? If you're down to that point where you just, you know, you got nothing left, there's no gas left in the tank, and it just everything feels useless, whatever. At that moment, if you're able to reframe what's happening and say, I mean, I think I've said it before on one of my videos, but like, bonus life, baby. This is, I mean, everything from here on out's a bonus. So it's like, I'm going to try something completely new, something completely outrageous that I've never done before, because everything from this point on is, you know, is a gift. And so it's like, I think that mindset and that curiosity to just start having, and to get out of that comfort zone, in that state of kind of paralysis that you find yourself stuck in, just everything is, you know, is a chance to feel better from here on out.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I spill the beans a little bit?
Do it.
Okay.
I don't know what it is, but do it.
Well, so listeners, I know a lot of listeners, always want to know how I find these guests, and you were referred to me by Alex Conley with Kono Nutrition. And so shout out to him, because he was able to get us connected. But two, like, you and him building, you know, kind of this community for men, and who knows what it's going to look like who knows where it's going to go. But I just want to like put this on the podcast so it makes you guys feel a little bit more like held accountable, because I see so much need for a men's, you know, kind of collaboration and coming together and being men again. You know, like, life is fucking hard, but you know, there is so much that men need men, and they need mentors, and they need other people to know, like, hey, I've gone through this, and I've had depression, but like, let me help you, you know. And there's so much between even you and Alex both, and just getting to really put you guys together and to build this, because like I said, I can see it in men. You know, and there's so many people that are like, why are you single still? I'm like, have you seen our men? Like, have you seen our men? Low quality. Like, we need some better quality men. Okay. Yeah. So I'm putting this on the podcast. So you're like, yep. All right. Okay. We got to make better quality men. And it's like, not a bash, but it's like, there's not really any way for them to go. And there's not really any place for them to like get back to their own roots. And people are confused of what gender they are, and people are confused about life, and people are confused about like, which route do I go, or which girl do I date? Like, there's so much confusion. And with your guys's, you know, just brains, I know that you'll grow something incredible. And so listeners, look out for that as well. As we wrap up, is there anything else that you would want our listeners to hear today?
No, I'm just grateful you had me on. And I think, I mean, I say it all the time, and I think it's pretty generic, but it's just one day at a time. Yeah. You know, I think so many of the things that we feel is because we get so outside of ourselves and what's happening today and here and now, and we start thinking too far ahead or too far behind, and learning to stay more present, regardless of modality, right? Whether you use breath work or cold plunging, or going for a drive in your car, or anything. Learning to stay more present, I think, is a huge thing that I've been adopting more lately. And so it's one day at a time. Everything's one day at a time. So
For sure. Well, I appreciate you. Listeners, all of his information is in the show notes. So if you want to get in contact with Cam, you're more than welcome to do that. Please reach out to him. If you're somebody that just feels connected, reach out to him. Tell him that. Make sure that you know that you are not alone and there are people out there. It is really scary. It is really intimidating, but I promise you, through vulnerability, you find connections and strength. So thank you again for another wonderful podcast. I will talk to you guys next week. Love you.